Welcome and good afternoon. This is Libby Mucciaroni, Member Engagement and Education Manager at the Organic Trade Association. I'm pleased to welcome you to our webinar today on building soil health for organic systems, presented by Dr. Kate Tully from the University of Maryland and Dr. Amber Saligo of the Organic Center. The Organic Center is a nonprofit research and education organization based out of Washington, D.C. They work to conduct and convene credible evidence-based science on the environmental and health effects of organic food and farming and communicate the findings to the public. The Organic Center's work is supported by companies and individuals who desire a sustainable and secure food system that promotes the health of humans and the environment. A few things before we get started today. This webinar will be recorded. In the next week, Organic Trade Association members and attendees today will receive a follow-up email including the PDF slides and the ability to view the recording. During registration for this webinar, we provided registrants, all of you, an opportunity to ask Dr. Tully and Dr. Saligo questions about soil health. Thank you to those of you who provided feedback. We received over 70 questions. Many of these questions have been taken into account in both today's presentation and in preparation for what we truly believe will be a robust and informative Q&A session. Please also note that we have a handout attached in the platform that you can download, and this will also be emailed out to all attendees next week. For any additional questions or comments that you may have during our presentation today, please share them with us in the questions panel on the platform. Following the presentation, we will have a Q&A session where our presenters will respond to your questions as time permits. And finally, if you happen to have any technical issues during the presentation today, notify us through the questions panel, or you can email me directly. Now I'd like to introduce our host for today's webinar, my colleague, Dr. Amber Saligo. Dr. Saligo is the Associate Director of Science Programs at the Organic Center. Thanks so much.
Okay, great. Well, hello, everybody. I am so excited to be here, and I'm actually a little bit intimidated, to be honest, because we have such an impressive audience today. I am stunned by the numbers and the diversity of the people who have signed up. So today we are going to talk a lot about soil health, and my presentation is going to be a bit more big picture before I hand it over to Dr. Tully, who's going to dive a little bit deeper into some of the specific practices that will support soil health. So in keeping with the theme of the bigger picture, I'll start by talking about climate change, because soil health and climate change really go hand in hand. Thank you. So also to really understand how climate change is influencing agriculture in general, but also organic agriculture in particular, I'm first going to talk about the weather for two reasons. One, because weather is something that just about everybody can relate to, especially farmers, and it's one of the most tangible symptoms of climate change. And two, because the changes in weather patterns and extreme weather events that are associated with climate change will affect the baseline conditions that farmers have to adapt to, and that's really where soil health fits in. So I'll talk briefly about major shifts in weather patterns and how organic agriculture is affected by this. And I'll also talk about how organic production can ultimately help mitigate climate change. And then finally, I'll end on a little bit about how soil health fits into that equation before I hand it over to Dr. Tully. When it comes to weather data, NOAA, which is the National Oceanic, what is this that I have here? National Oceanic Atmospheric Association. I always get that acronym wrong. They have this really amazing interactive database where you can look at how all kinds of different weather variables have changed over time across either the US as a whole, or you can look at different regions within it, which is what you see here. NOAA has this historic data that starts back from 1910. So you can either look at long-term trends in things like temperature or rainfall, or you can also look at how more recent years are comparing to the average across those last 100+ years of data. I would say that if you are interested at all in regional or national trends in weather and climate change indicators, that you should really check out this resource and play around with the data. The program is a lot of fun, actually. It takes a lot of, I have spent a lot of time on it geeking out about the weather, but it actually lets you create graphs and figures from the data that you select, which is what I have done for you today. And today I'm just going to briefly show you some US national trends, and a couple variables, temperature and rainfall. So let's first take a look at how temperatures have been changing over time in the US as a whole. What you're looking at here is a graph of temperatures that are either below normal, which are indicated in blue, or above normal in red. The temperatures that are closer to the average will have shorter bars, and those that are further will have longer bars. And this allows you to see how extremes in temperature have occurred in the past, as well as how the overall trend has changed over the past 110 years. And what you can see here is how our nation has been getting warmer, and particularly in the last 30 years, where we've had a lot more above normal temperatures than below normal temperatures. And while we know that different parts of the country have their own trends, you know, there are some places that might have been getting cooler. Overall, our nation is getting warmer, and this has important implications for farmers. So while temperature, of course, is important, so is rainfall. If we get too little or too much water, then there can be extreme consequences for food production. So instead of graphing the total, the national average over time, here I've plotted a shorter time period that you can see across all the states. So this map here shows how rain patterns have changed in the last year. You see areas that were drier than normal, those are indicated in brown. Where it's been normal, it's white. And those that were wetter than normal are a blue-green color. And the darker the blue-green color, the wetter the region. And again, when I say normal, I mean the average across the last 110 years. When we look at these maps over longer periods of time, which I'm not showing you here, we can see that some regions that have been typically dry are getting drier, like out west, even though in this particular last season, you can see that out west, at least in California, there was a little bit more water than normal, but definitely up north in Washington, you see it's still pretty dry. And there are other regions that have been typically wet and are continuing to get wetter. But what's really interesting is the regions where things have sort of completely changed, where historically they were very dry and now they're very wet, or vice versa. So what this means is that farmers are dealing with changing conditions that they might not be used to. And the plants and insects might not be used to them either. Everything is changing. So this will affect everything from soil fertility management to how farmers deal with pest and disease pressures. I also want to just quickly acknowledge extreme weather events like severe tropical and winter storms, hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, and fires. These events can be very catastrophic and devastating. They can wipe out an operation or permanently alter the growing conditions for farmers. And NOAA has also been tracking the frequency of these extreme events. And I'm not showing the data to you here, but what we can see is that these extreme weather events have been steadily increasing in the US over the past 40 years. And I'm sure if you think back in your recent history, even your longer past, this will resonate with most of us on this call today. And all of these changes in weather that are associated with climate change, and Libby, we're still on the other slide, just you can pop back there. So all of these changes, things in weather are associated with climate change. And like I said, they can completely reshape agricultural landscapes and conditions. So more specifically, this means that there will be changes in ideal planting and harvest times. There will be changes in irrigation needs, as well as the availability of water for that irrigation. This also means that farmers now need plants that can tolerate extreme heat or cold, or tolerate drought or excessive rain at times and in ways that just don't match up with the traditional experience for which they've been bred for in the past. And also, these plants have to be more resistant to pests and diseases because these pressures will increase with warmer conditions. One example of this is that when it's warmer, pest populations are active for more months out of the year, which means they need to eat more crops or plant tissue to stay alive for longer. And in addition, the warmer winters don't knock back those pest populations as much as the colder ones. So the next spring, when it starts, and especially if it starts earlier, it'll start with more pests sort of right out the gate. So the question is, how does all of this affect organic farming differently than non-organic? Organic farming doesn't have the same chemical arsenal to defend against really fast changes in pest and disease pressures or soil fertility. Instead, organic farming depends on whole system processes, and it takes time to build the health of the farm and defenses in this way. So when extreme weather knocks back those defenses, it will take time for them to recover when recovery is possible. Okay, now you can flip forward, Libby, thanks. So with that being said, there's a little bit of a silver lining in that organic farming can be more adaptive to extreme weather events such as flood and drought and even pest and disease pressures, as long as those weather events don't totally raise the farm to the ground. A lot of organic practices build strong communities of beneficial biodiversity both above and below the ground that really help defend against pests and diseases. And other organic practices will build soil health and fertility, which helps prevent against erosion and flooding by holding more water in the soil. And I'll let Dr. Tully share more detailed examples later. But the take-home message is that while organic farming can be more vulnerable once the straw breaks the camel's back, it might actually take longer to reach that breaking point, which helps organic farmers adapt to climate change and the changing weather that's coming with it. So when we talk about adaptation to climate change or changing weather, we really need to focus on soil health. Soil health is an old concept that is becoming repopularized. It's very basically defined as the soil's capacity to function. Soil health means you'll have healthier plants, and it means less erosion and more water holding capacity that can protect against droughts and flooding. Before Dr. Tully dives into the various components of soil that qualify it as quote unquote healthy, I want to highlight the importance of soil organic carbon for a couple of reasons. The first is because soil organic carbon is a critical component of soil health, which contributes to the success of farm production. And the second is because it's also a critical player in climate change mitigation, as this is where we store carbon and keep it from releasing into the atmosphere as a greenhouse gas. There is a growing body of research that points to organic farming techniques as a way to build soil carbon while also reducing greenhouse gas emissions and improving energy efficiency. These are things like fallowing, which is letting the ground rest, which will allow organic matter to accumulate and decompose and then restore the nutrients back to the soil in that process. We just have to make sure that the ground that's resting is not bare, as this can cause erosion and loss of organic matter over time. And using cover crops is a really great way to rest the land while also sequestering carbon and building soil organic matter. The use of crop rotations, and particularly perennials, can also help build organic matter in the soil. And using manure and legumes for fertilizer can be especially important because using these alternatives not only puts organic matter back into the soil, but it also reduces the demand for and the production of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. And this is actually really key to mitigating climate change. There are studies that compare energy consumption and the global warming potential of organic to non-organic farming that show that organic farming can win by a long shot when you're considering the energy consumption and the greenhouse gases that are emitted from just the process of creating that synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. Life cycle assessments of many different cropping systems show that the use of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer is the #1 driver of global warming potential for farming. So when we use green and bio-based manures, then we are farming in a climate-friendly way. And finally, organic farming prohibits the use of most synthetic pesticides. And like synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, pesticides are also very intensive to create and to apply. But a key point that I want to make here is that we know that the use of pesticides and herbicides can negatively impact beneficial microbial communities in the soil. We know it's above ground and it's also below ground. And this reduces the functional capacity of soil. And it also reduces the elements that would otherwise increase carbon sequestration and overall soil health. I think that this is a really critical discussion point when it comes to talking about regenerative farming. And I think we're going to talk a little bit more about this in the Q&A session, but I'll mention it briefly here too, that when chemicals are used to kill weeds instead of tilling the soil or using other mechanical practices that will knock back those weeds, those chemicals affect important above and below ground biodiversity, which is critical for replenishing and sustaining the land for future food and fiber production. So when we think of it like that, pest and weed management that uses harsh chemicals can't be considered regenerative or a climate-friendly practice. So organic practices can help mitigate climate change, and all agricultural systems can incorporate some of these organic compliant practices that help reduce greenhouse gas emissions and store carbon in the soil. For my last point, I just want to dive a little bit deeper again into soil organic carbon. And it turns out that soil under organic management can store more carbon at deeper depths where the carbon is locked away for longer periods of time. And even if you were to compare full tillage under organic management to conventional no-till, we find that organic soils are still able to hold more carbon. Most of the research that's out there, though, looks at overall soil organic carbon, but there are different components of the soil that store carbon in different ways. So some store it for the short term and some store it for the long term. And when you look at only overall soil organic carbon, you can't really fully understand what the potential there is for climate change mitigation without looking at the proportion of the long-term carbon storage. So we at the Organic Center were really interested in this, and we partnered with Northeastern University to measure long-term carbon storage in organic versus conventional soils. And with nearly 1,500 soil samples from across all types of cropping systems, we found that organic soils contained 26% more long-term carbon storage than conventional, which was really great news. So in conclusion, we know that organic practices have a lot of benefits that help farmers adapt to as well as mitigate climate change. But we also want to move organic beyond the baseline benefits that are required in the National Organic Standards towards an even greater impact on climate change mitigation. And in order to do that, we have to really understand which specific practices have the biggest impact on soil health and carbon sequestration, which is what Dr. Tolley will talk about next. So I'm going to go ahead and do her brief introduction. Oh, yes, and don't let me forget about our sponsors. So Dr. Tolley and her team at the University of Maryland, they've been doing some really fantastic research that's been funded by Annie's in Patagonia and the GROW Voluntary Research and Promotion Program. They've been looking within organic to find which techniques are doing the best jobs at building soil health and sequestering carbon so that we can amplify and leverage those the best regenerative aspects of organic. And so now I will introduce Dr. Tolley and let her share the results of her work with you. So Dr. Kate Tolley is an assistant professor of agroecology at the University of Maryland. She earned a bachelor's degree in English, Spanish, and biology from Kenyon College and a master's and doctorate in ecology from the University of Virginia. She conducted postdoctoral research at Columbia University's Earth Institute, where she studied the environmental impacts of African Green Revolution and lived in Kenya and Tanzania. Broadly, her research examines how to manage farming systems so that they can both adapt to and mitigate climate change.
Thank you. We're going to do a little transfer to my screen. So hopefully you guys can all see that. All right. Well, thank you all for attending. We have, like Amber and Libby said, we have a great group here. So I'm really excited to talk about some of my research today. So what I wanted to first say that, and Amber already alluded to this, but this research was funded through the Organic Center, so I'm really grateful to them for that funding. And what I'm trying to dive into in this work is to look at soil health indicators among organic systems. So there's been a lot of work about comparing organic systems to conventional systems, which is great. But really starting to figure out what are those practices that we have available to us as organic farmers that can really promote soil health. And part of that is because our organic systems are so diverse. So trying to think about what are those specific practices, and that's what this work is really about. So first, I'm going to define soil health. Amber already did this a little bit, but soil health is defined as the capacity of the soil to function as a vital living ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, and humans. And so some of you, especially if you're a farmer, you might sort of have like an innate sense of what your healthy soil looks like. It might have that like dark, rich, organic material in it. And so you might already have a sense of what that is, but this is sort of the general definition, and then there needs to be some sort of indicators, like how are we going to measure soil health, this thing that sort of feels almost like innate. So what we do is we've broken down soil health into about 3 different sort of components. There are the physical aspects of soil health, the chemical aspects of soil health, and then the biological aspects of soil health. And so in 2015, the Soil Health Institute generated what they called their Tier 1 indicators of soil health, and it's a very long list, so I'm not going to go through all of those today, but I just wanted to focus on a couple different indicators, and then we'll look at how those play out when we actually look in organic systems. So we'll start here with our physical soil health indicators. So those are things like aggregate stability. So how sticky is your soil? So you've probably scooped up a handful of soil before, and if it's kind of like gooey and the soil really sticks together, that's because it's got all those great microbes in there, a lot of carbon, and so that would be good aggregate stability. A soil that's been tilled for many, many, many years and maybe never has had cover crops, it might sort of disintegrate in your hands and almost feel like kind of sand, and that would be a soil that has poor aggregate stability. Water holding capacity, so the ability of your soil to hold on to water when you want it to hold on to water so that it can provide that water to the plants. And then also the importance of getting water off the field when you don't want water on the field. So the infiltration of water, the drainage of water off of your field would be another soil health indicator for the physical components. And then finally, runoff and erosion. And so you can imagine that if you are literally losing soil because of some of the management practices on a farm, that's not going to maintain your health, the health of your soil sustainably. So trying to find out what those practices are that minimize the erosion of your soil, but also the runoff of any of these, the synthetic chemicals that you might use. You might see it in a conventional system, but even those nutrients that we might be adding in an organic form within our organic farms. Chemical soil health indicators, there are many of these. I'm just going to focus on a few. So the nitrogen, the amount of nitrogen we have in our soil, phosphorus, and potassium. These are the main nutrients that we add to our farms anyway. Some other things that might fall under this category include the pH, which of course we know is really important if you're growing specific kinds of berries, for instance. And then also if you're out west, or if you're in the Dakotas, you might have issues with salinity or the sodicity of your soil. So especially if the soils have seen many, many years of irrigation, you can actually see the salt content building up in your soils, and that would be another indicator of your chemical soil health. And then biological soil health are things like organic matter. And Amber already sort of alluded to this, but the importance of having that soil organic carbon, I'm going to talk more about that at the end. But this is an indicator of the biological health of your soil, the microbial biomass, so who's there and how much of everybody is there. So having a lot of diversity in your microbial community means that you can break down a lot of different kinds of organic material. It means that you have nitrogen fixation, and so they do a lot of different processes in the soil. So it's important to have high microbial biomass diversity and also abundance. Earthworm abundance. This is a very visual indicator of soil health. I'm sure we've all, scooped up a handful of compost and seen some of our worms wiggling around in there. So that's another good indicator of biological soil health. And then finally, weed pressure and diversity. So having soils that have a really high weed seed bank, obviously we know that that can be very challenging as an organic farmer. There also are weeds that are visual indicators of, for instance, low nutrient capacity. So when I lived in Kenya, there was the strigo weed has a blue or purplish flower on it, and if you saw that on a field, you could know just by sight that that soil was not healthy, that it was really depleted in organic matter and really depleted in nitrogen. So in some cases, the weeds can actually tell us a little bit visually about the health of our soils. So as I mentioned, there's been a lot of research that has looked at the comparison of organic and conventional farming. And this is just a paper that we can probably send out to you if you're interested in, by Reginald and Wachter. It's a great article that does a really holistic view of comparing conventional agricultural systems to organic agricultural systems and looking at a suite of different indicators. And I just want to focus on a couple things because I don't want to downplay the importance of comparing organic to conventional, but what this study is trying to do is move a little bit beyond that. So for instance, we know, as Amber already said, that organic systems tend to minimize water pollution and minimize the pesticide residues. So that's an environmental benefit that's different from our conventional counterparts. Yields tend to be a little bit lower in organic systems, but it's very variable and it depends on the specific crop. Organic yields actually tend to increase through time, so you actually see improved yields as the longer that you're in organic. Also, you'll tend to see that organic systems are much more resilient to climate change. So if you do an average of many years, you may actually see that organic farming can be just as productive as conventional farming. We're going to focus on soil quality. So Amber already alluded to this, but the soil organic carbon tends to be much higher in organic farms than it does in conventional farms. There's a lot more biodiversity in organic farms because we have longer rotations, tend to have longer rotations. We have more even distribution of different kinds of crops within those rotations, and we just have more types of crops in general. Oftentimes, organic will also come out on top in terms of economics, because with the price premiums, organics can actually be more profitable and has a higher benefit to cost ratio than conventional farming. And then although organic farming tends to require more labor, we tend to see reduced exposure to pesticides and herbicides, and also a lot of organic certification programs require these programs to adopt these social well-being or human well-being components and guidelines. And so all this is to say that there's a ton of research that has looked at this organic versus conventional comparison, even with sort of dabbling in soil health. But what I really wanted to do here was to focus on organic agricultural systems. So what we did was called a systematic review, which means that we scoured the literature and I looked for articles that compared at least two organic practices. So not organic till and conventional till, but organic no-till to organic till, for instance. And that would actually report these soil health indicators like we talked about, the organic matter, the abundance of earthworms, nitrogen, phosphorus, things like that. So this was a global search. We found about 1,600 articles that we had to screen to make sure they could be included in this review, and we concluded with 153 articles. And what we found was, as we were digging through the literature, there was really 4 key practices that people are manipulating in the literature. Of course, on our farms, we're probably manipulating a variety of different practices, but there really are 4 different practices that emerged from the literature review, and that was, they're going to look familiar, cover crops, organic amendments, rotation, diversity, and length, and tillage. So I'm going to go into just a touch of detail about how those are manipulated now. So for cover crops, these are going to be studies that looked at different species of cover crops. Maybe the way that those cover crops were terminated or killed, were they disked or were they rolled? Looking at termination, the timing. So did you kill your cover crop early or did you kill it late? And then also some cover crop and fertilizer effects. For organic amendments, this is really simple. It's just, what did you add? Is it compost, bokashi, manure, or biochar? And then how much of it did you add? So just the rate and the type. For rotation, it's diversity. So what are the different species that were there? The length of those rotations, and also looking at the complexity of those rotations, and then grain rotations versus some forage rotations. And then tillage is just that sort of that gradient of no-till, reduced-till, conventional till. Okay, so we're gonna dive into the data. So the first thing I just wanted to show you here was the number of studies that were available to us. So one thing that's really interesting is when you kind of plot these along a timeline, you'll see there were very few studies up until the 2000s that really looked at organic agriculture, that thought of organic agriculture as nuanced. Of course, we know it is. Between 2000 and 2009, there were about 44 studies that actually compared organic systems. And then from 2010 to 2018, there were about 107. So we really see this build, this sort of, this momentum in the literature focusing on organic agriculture, which is really exciting. Okay. So what we're going to look at here are the different soil health outcomes by these key practices. So you're going to see some bars, the colored bars. So if you see green, those are the cover crop practices. Organic amendments is in orange, rotation is going to be in purple, and tillage is going to be in pink. And what we're going to see here is just sort of the frequency, the number of times that studies looked at these different practices and how they affected all of our organic, all of our soil health indicators, which are on the bottom. So infiltration, soil organic carbon, nutrient cycling. So here, what we see, a couple things emerge. The first is that we really see that organic amendments and manipulating organic amendments is very popular. So we see these orange bars in the soil organic carbon column, the microbial biomass column, and then also nutrient cycling. So people are really interested in measuring those different indicators when they manipulate organic amendments. Very few studies, which I found really interesting, actually look at the impact of organic agriculture on things like infiltration, water holding capacity, and aggregate stability. Even though we know that organic agriculture can clearly alter those different factors, we don't actually see a lot of studies. So this is an avenue for future research here. So now I'm going to show you a very, very busy map. So I'll just orient you here. This is to give us a sense of where these studies are conducted throughout the globe and what people are looking at when they're trying to look at organic agriculture. So if you see a country that's in gray, that is a country where a study has been conducted. It could be just one, but that's where a study's been conducted. You're going to see some numbers popping up in little circles. Those are the number of studies that were conducted in that country. And then these green dots are these locations of what we're calling long-term organic agricultural research sites. So we identified these throughout the world where people had been collecting data for more than 10 years on organic systems. As we know, organic systems really can take some time for the yields to really increase. And so these long-term research sites are incredibly important places for us to gather more information. So we wanted to make sure we could identify all of those across the globe. So here is more detail. What you can see here is the same colors. So these pie charts are just telling us of these, for instance, 55 studies in the United States, that's what that circle is, we see that about a third of them are manipulating rotations, a third of them are manipulating organic amendments, and then about a sixth are manipulating the cover crops and tillage. And so the size and also the size of these pie charts indicate the number of indicators that somebody's looking at. So for instance, there's a study in Sweden where all of they're just manipulating organic amendments, but they measured a very large suite of indicators. So what we found when we look at across the globe is about 80 studies were conducted in the US and Europe, and we identified 23 of these long-term organic agricultural research sites. And again, most of the studies manipulated organic amendments. You can imagine that's kind of almost like an easier one to manipulate in many ways, because you can kind of do these combinations of different organic treatments in pretty small plots. So let's go into a little bit more about the findings here. So across all these studies, we found that roll-killed cover crops, for the cover crop category, we found that roll-killed cover crops suppressed weeds better than disking. We found that combinations of organic amendments, so for instance, mixing vermicompost with manure, improved soil health metrics across the board. So the more we would call these like cocktails of different kinds of amendments, those are going to be better at improving your soil health metrics. Including a perennial or sometimes a semi-perennial crop like alfalfa can improve your soil carbon and nitrogen and aggregate stability. And then soil health improved under shallow non-inversion tillage compared to conventional tillage. So these are sort of our main findings for each of those different practices. And the next steps of this research is now to get a little bit more empirical or analytical. So we've identified these different practices, and one of the things we want to do next is to actually try to figure out which of these practices can confer the greatest benefit to soil health. So are there some practices that are better than others within organic where we might be really wanting to make sure that we are putting more of our research dollars into it, and also putting a lot of our effort into improving those practices. So for this, we're going to focus on soil organic carbon. Like Amber mentioned, I see it as really sort of it is the glue that holds the soil together, but it has its fingers in all of the different aspects of soil health. So it affects the physical soil health by affecting aggregate stability. It is an indicator of biological soil health, and then it also is related to chemical soil health because of its impact on, obviously, the recycling of nitrogen and phosphorus through these systems. So for this, we're going to do a meta-analysis, and that will be, that's forthcoming. There's a little preview here on the right here of what we're looking at, but we're really trying to identify these practices that we should put a lot of our energy into improving soil health on our organic farms. And so why spend all this time thinking about soil health? Well, Amber already alluded to this, but soil health I really see is at the nexus of all of these wicked problems that we're facing in the world. So there's a lot of research that shows healthy soils means that you have healthy people. That means that you're going to have higher food security. It improves our water quality. It can affect climate change. It can mitigate climate change by the amount of carbon we store in these systems. It increases biodiversity, and there's these impacts on farm economics. So understanding the management impacts of soil, on soil health, I think is of critical importance as we move forward, and we start thinking about how are we going to make our agricultural systems more sustainable. And that is all I have. Thank you all very much. And you can reach me at my email down there. You can check out my lab website, and then you can find me on Twitter.
Great, thank you. Great, thank you so much, Kate. We really appreciate your time and joining us. And as Amber gets on screen as well, I wanted to thank both you and Amber for so much hard time and effort and work you put into this research, into the presentation today. For the remainder of our time, we'll be taking questions, both that you all submitted as well as those that you have typed in today, those of you that are in attendance. Again, we would encourage you, if you have any questions that you haven't heard answered so far today, to please use the questions box in the GoToWebinar panel to ask any of those questions. And if we're unable to respond to any of those from today, we will follow up with you as time permits. For all of the technical questions that we received today, we wanted to make a quick note to you. We have received quite a number of them with asking for specific recommendations on topics, such as how to compost, organic weed control, how to build soil under various circumstances, or steps for implementing some of the strategies that we highlighted today during the webinar. So we've attached a handout with some resources for you for free access to more information in case you want to dive more in depth into any of the topics that we've covered here today. You'll be able to download that handout right now. We'll also circulate that in email next week, as well as the recording of today's webinar. I do want to note that in the handout, we've included a link to the USDA NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and that allows you to find local experts in your region. These will be the best people, truthfully, for you to be reaching out to, for you to really gain context-dependent questions that are specific, both to your region and to the growing conditions. So with that in mind, I'm going to start with a couple of questions that we had received via email. And Kate, Dr. Tully and Dr. Sligo will be both responding to these questions as they fit their own expertise and knowledge, and get excited. There's really some interesting and exciting information to be shared with all of you today. So the first question we have is, what is the difference between organic and conventional when it comes to tillage? Amber, we've got you muted. Amber, I'm trying to unmute you. Thanks. Yeah, here we go.
Now?
Now we can hear you. Thank you.
Oh gosh, that's like the story of the times right now. Okay, so I'll go ahead and start again and say that this is a question that we get asked a lot, and that's because there's sort of this double myth that organic doesn't sequester carbon because of tillage, and that conventional farming uses conservation tillage a lot more than organic farms. So to debunk the first myth, there's some really great research that's out there by a USDA scientist, Michel Cavagelli, and he's done some extensive work that found that even organic with full tillage can do better at storing carbon in the soil than conventional no-till. And this is because carbon in the no-till system mostly accumulates on the surface, where those plant residues are deposited, but in an organic tillage system, those residues are kind of worked down into the soil a little bit more and buried deeper. So there's this greater soil carbon at deeper depths, where it's more resilient to degradation, if I can say the word. So this isn't, we're not trying to suggest that you shouldn't be promoting reduced tillage for soil conservation, but the suite of soil fertility management practices that are out there that are used by organic farmers in combination with conservation tillage still leads to greater increases in soil carbon than no-till conventional. And then just quickly to address the second myth, according to National Agricultural Statistics Services, which is NASS, there's a similar percentage of organic and conventional farms that are using conservation tillage. And then finally, there's a lot of research that's happening right now on organic systems that can help determine ways for us to improve and expand the organic no-till operations. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you want to add any more to that, Kate.
That was a great answer.
Great, thank you so much. So how about another question here? How does soil health play into food safety?
That's another good question. This is actually something that we're really interested in at the Organic Center, and we are currently collaborating with UC Davis as well as several other top-tier universities on a USDA-funded project that is asking just this question. So we're trying to understand that interplay between soil health and food safety, because it's really important for organic farmers, especially because soil health, the soil health that organic farmers are supporting will enrich the soil microbial ecosystem, which can help fight human pathogens. And so one of our partners at Cornell is actually currently developing an education module right now that will cover food safety and help share some of the best practices that have been developed through the study. So stay tuned, because as soon as that's ready, we're going to put it on our website.
Great, thank you, Amber. Thank you, Amber, so much. So another question that we have is, do these soil health topics apply to growing organic cotton and wool, or et cetera?
Yeah, I'm really glad that this was brought up, because there are other organic sectors outside of food. We have food and fiber. And because our findings in the research projects that we're working on aren't just limited to the food sector. We actually have a project right now that's working in collaboration with Iowa State University, and we're looking at the environmental impacts of organic cotton. And we actually just submitted it for, well, we submitted the manuscript on this research for publication. So we also have several blogs and some hot science posts that you can find on our website that are all about organic textiles, as well as body care. And what we're seeing is that practices that support soil health and adapt to climate change and mitigate climate change for food crops can protect agricultural production across the board, including fiber production.
Yeah, and I would just add to that these practices, you know, just because they work in a field crop setting, this is sort of what Amber was already saying, it doesn't mean they're not going to work in these other settings. So something like the recommendation of using multiple kinds of organic amendment, that combination, that's something that's very transferable between these different cropping systems.
Great, thanks both of you. So I have another question here. Do I need to worry about available nitrogen loss when adding wood ash or biochar or other carbon-rich materials to my soils?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when you think about the kinds of additions, this is actually similar to what I was saying about the multiple kinds of organic additions. Farmers will often be worried about the soil actually holding on to those nutrients. So we call that immobilization. So you might add an amendment and then the soil kind of holds on to it. But if you add these amendments that are already sort of high in nitrogen, you're not going to see that immobilization happen. So I did see it a lot when I was working in East Africa because the amendments were so poor. So you're trying to fertilize corn with corn stover, which, you know, just with the residue and nothing else. And so then you would see the soil actually holding on to nitrogen. But when you're adding things like the high quality biochars, high quality cover crops, you're probably going to see maybe a little bit of that at the beginning, but then it's going to be released into the system and available for those crops to take up.
Great, thank you very much. So I have another question here for both of you. What is the role of livestock in soil health and climate change?
Ooh.
This is a tricky one. You want me to start, or do you want to start?
I can start. I'll kick this one over to you in a second. So this is a great question. I talk about this all the time in class, and I think you know, there's this. I wouldn't say it's a myth, but there's oftentimes it's like cows are terrible, they're so bad. Well, first of all, cows are very nice, but it's really the way we manage them that we have to think about it. So everything that I was talking about, these management systems, that's the key to being able to still integrate livestock into our agricultural systems. So the fact that we have disintegrated the relationship between livestock and crops is one of the reasons that we see all these problems we have today. So the more that we can combine, have these mixed crop livestock systems, the more we're going to actually, you can build soil health that way. So there's, like, for instance, rotational grazing is a way of managing your livestock. So you kind of keep them in these little paddocks and you move them once a day or every other day. And the cows eat they eat not all the grass, but a lot of it, and then they poop and they step on their poop, and then you're just building carbon and you're building food. And then I was also mentioning these forage rotations. When you include those forage rotations, they do really well in terms of building soil health in your system. So it's really the way that we manage livestock that has created the host of problems that we see today. And there are ways that we can manage livestock systems differently and actually help them, you know, use them in such a way that they're helping build soil organic matter and improve soil health.
Yeah, that's really great. And I love that the thought of it seems so new to integrate livestock because it's been a long time since that was common practice. And I'll just add a couple points when we think about it, you know, livestock in this separated system, like you just mentioned, Kate. So, you know, I said this is sort of tricky to answer. It's a little bit political sometimes, but what I wanted to get out was that when we talk about production of animals, things get complicated because we have to think about the whole chain of production. I think a lot of times we focus just mostly on the animals and how they're raised, and we forget about what they're eating. So we have to really focus on from that whole chain of production, from the growing, the feed for the animals, all the way to the system that's raising the animals. So I also want to note that organic requires livestock to be on pasture for the entire pasture season, and any supplemental feed that they have has to be 100% certified organic. And I think so far in this presentation, we've probably hammered in the benefits of organic crop production. So we can say with confidence that organic livestock that are eating organic feed, that feed has been grown in a way that supports soil health and helps farmers adapt to and to mitigate climate change. And then there are also some important differences between the rules for how animals are raised for organic versus conventional production. And of course, you know, there's always going to be some variation in management strategies, but organic farmers have to adhere to at least the baseline standards and rules. And the main difference that we see is that organic ruminant livestock operations, so that's animals like cows, sheep, and goats, they have to be, they must have free access to certified organic pasture for that entire grazing season. And that is, the period is specific to farm's geographic climate, but it has to be at least 120 days. And this is really important because it means that this system includes a component of soil. And organic management of that pasture means, you know, soil health and carbon storage will be promoted. The opposite, most extreme conventional counterpart is the CAFO system. And CAFO means concentrated animal feeding operations. And these systems, in their biggest form, are basically soil-less. The animals are primarily raised on cement slabs and in cages, and manure is stored in large lagoons rather than incorporating it into a cropping system in a holistic way, much like Kate had talked about. So in these cases, when there's no soil, there's no healthy soil building, and there's no carbon storage to offset the methane and gases that come from the large manure lagoons.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thanks both of you for a really thorough response there. So I have another question. This one is from Jeff, who is in attendance today, and he said that the emphasis on practices is okay, but isn't this more of a system of production? Could you respond?
Like a whole systems approach, you mean, versus the practices, focusing on specific practices?
Yes, that's what it sounds like.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
You want to tackle that, Kate?
I can say something and then I'll turn it back over to you, which is that, yeah, completely. And like, you know, I'm looking at these practices in isolation. We never do them in isolation, right? It's like, we're clearly doing something with tillage, and we're also clearly doing something with organic amendments and cover crops, right? So what's tricky is to tease those things apart. So in the research, you know, it's sometimes really hard to tell, like, what's the impact of just doing this versus just doing this, and then also that's usually not just an additive effect. There's this sort of almost like multiplicative effect of doing a lot of these practices that can improve soil health. So I usually call that as like stacking practices, and we are actually looking into that in our next iteration of this research. So like, what is the impact on soil health of using cover crops and different kinds of organic amendments under reduced tillage? So I think you're right. I mean, if there's practices, which are these like specific things we do, but really when we're talking about improving soil health, it's like a holistic management approach, for sure.
Yeah, I'm really excited that you're doing more research in this field, because this is something that we talk about all the time. People ask this same question all the time when I give presentations about, well, basically anything in organic, because it's the way that we think about organic is more of a whole systems approach. It's not so formulaic. Mm-hmm. And yet when you're managing a farm, it's really helpful to understand that when you do X, you know, what is going to be the result. And we just don't have that much research right now that's looking at what happens when you combine all of these, all of the ingredients at once. It's hard to find. I mean, there are so many different farms that are doing so many different things, and to have any kind of replication in a scientific study, you know, it's very challenging because there's so much flexibility and because there's so much need for using different practices depending on your context for where you're trying to farm. So I'm excited that that's a next step for you.
Thanks so much for responding to that one. We have so many questions here that we're not going to be able to get to, but I'm going to wrap up with 2 more questions. The first of the 2 is, what is the difference between organic farming and regenerative farming systems?
This is another tricky question. And that's because the term regenerative, which is becoming a lot more popular these days, isn't nearly as well defined as organic, which is right now pretty clearly defined and regulated by the USDA. But if you're thinking about, the ability of a system to foster healthy ecosystems and to build healthy soil, organic is really this giant leap towards regenerative when you compare it to the average conventional operation. I know that I mentioned this a bit in my presentation, and I'll just reiterate again here that using harsh chemicals that can harm farm workers and birds and pollinators and other animals that are important for the whole system, as well as soil microorganisms, this is not allowing the system to regenerate for future production in its full capacity. So something we've been hearing a lot in the context of climate change right now is this misconception of how climate friendly and regenerative no-till conventional farming can be. Reduced tillage is certainly one aspect in reducing carbon loss, but most conventional no-till systems are managing their weeds by using synthetic herbicides like glyphosate. And this chemically disturbs the soil. The soil organisms that build the carbon storage potential are harmed, and there's a whole lot more that happens above ground with these sprays. So this is just one example, but I think it's a good example to remind us that we need to think more about the whole system when it comes to defining practices as regenerative or not. And regenerative is also just one piece of that whole systems puzzle that is organic. And it's in our nature, again, we were just talking about this, to simplify, but ecosystems are not simple. They're very complex with a lot of interactions and relationships. And so we can't just define regenerative as, no-till. It has to be placed into the context of organics so that we are still able to maintain the other aspects that are going to support those healthy ecosystems.
Thank you so much. And the final question that I have for you all today is, how do we turn this data into marketable data to share with consumers?
Ooh, I like that.
Do you like it in the sense that you want to start, or?
It's a great question. It's a great question. I mean, I'm not an economist, so I'm not going to have like the perfect answer to this, but I do think that, of course there are issues with the way that there are some labels that are not regulated, right? And we all know that, like you see like, free range and cage free, and so there are these terms that we can sometimes use that don't really have a lot of meaning, right? And organic agriculture is regulated, but it does ask an interesting question about like what about, these soil building practices, so like, is there a space for like the healthy soil stamp of approval, which means like maybe you're doing a couple of these practices on a specific, within a specific field. You're using cover cropping, you're using multiple kinds of organic amendments, and you're doing reduced tillage. I don't know, but I do think that more and more the public is interested in voting with their dollars for practices that are environmentally sustainable. And the practices that we talked about today are those kinds of practices, those kinds of management options that organic farmers are already doing, and we can just maybe tweak them and fine tune them so that we can store even more carbon.
Yeah, that's great. And I'll say, outside of the labeling system, which is one great way that we communicate with consumers, that the organic sector has been working on developing this industry invested research, promotion, and education checkoff like program, referred to as Grow Organic, which is what helped partially fund this work that we did here and talked about today. And And this program doesn't just fund the research on organic systems, but it also helps communicate these best practices that we talked about today to growers, as well as get information out to the consumers through education. So I just throw in that bit too.
Mm-hmm. Oh, you're muted.
I'm muted again?
No, you're good.
No, I did it this time, Amber. Thanks to both Dr. Saligo and Dr. Tully for, I think, a really fantastic and educational webinar today on building soil health for organic systems. And thanks to all of you in attendance. We had over 250 of you joining us today, and it was really fantastic to see the group that we had here. A reminder again that we do have a handout that you can download, and next week we will be providing you both that handout as well as a link to re-listen to this webinar and grab more morsels and snippets of information that they provided to you. We'd love for you all to consider joining us at one of our upcoming webinars. You can learn more about the webinars from both the Organic Center and the Organic Trade Association at ota.com under programs and events. The Organic Trade Association is a membership-based organization for the organic industry. We ensure that all parts along the organic value chain have a strong voice with government and the public. We bring farmers, processors, distributors, retailers, and others together to promote and protect the growing organic sector. OTA represents its members to government on sector needs, market development and promotion, and strong organic standards and regulations. Members also receive the latest information on quick answers on organic regulations and standards in the US and around the world. Again, a reminder that the slides and registration link to view the recording and the handout will all be provided to you in attendance and those of you that registered next week. On behalf of the Organic Center and the Organic Trade Association and our presenters today, we appreciate your time and your attendance at today's webinar, and please have a wonderful and safe day. Thank you. Thanks, ladies.
Thanks.